All right. Welcome again, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. So, to give a quick introduction, so today's event will be the Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism, being very glad to host Professor Jakob Kapeller. He's a professor at the Institute for Socio-Economics at the University of Duisburg-Essen, as well as affiliated at the University of Linz. And he'll talk today about past and future of pluralism in economics and give a personal outlook. We're very excited about that. In addition to that, Jakob Kapeller is also the editor of the Heterodox Economics Newsletter. He has published extensively in the fields, both in journals as well as by having written 2 books on the subject. So we are very glad and pleased to have him here with us today. Before I'll hand the floor to him, just a couple of housekeeping items. So I would ask everyone to mute themselves during the presentation so we have no interruptions. If you have questions, please post them in the chat and there'll be the opportunity for Q&A in the end. And I'll read all the questions out loud so everyone can participate. Yeah, without further ado, welcome Professor Kapeller, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, am I muted? No.
We can hear you.
Great. Many thanks for having me today, and many thanks, of course, also for the kind introduction. I will simply maybe make my light more digestible. So, past and future of pluralism in economics, a personal outlook. Why is that? Maybe because I've been concerned with the idea of pluralism in economics maybe now for a decade, and I have dealt with a variety of aspects on the issue. And I want, so to say, draw on a few facets and simply show a little bit what my thoughts are and also what I've done in the past. So I would say it makes sense to differentiate 3 streams of pluralism-related research, and so to say, different foci are very clear. For one, we have work that tries to explain why pluralism could have some merit in scientific research. This would be justifying pluralism. Then we have, so to say, research that is maybe more concerned with economics directly, that asks, is economics actually pluralist, and to what extent is it pluralist, and where is it pluralist? And this would be analyzing pluralism. And finally, the most interesting thing maybe is doing pluralism. So how could pluralist research look like? What could be the, so to say, unique selling proposition of a pluralist research strategy? And I will talk about all these 3 things in turn. So letting me give you my view on why we need some kind of pluralism. And I have mainly 2 reasons. One is more epistemologically and one is more practically. And my epistemological take on the subject is basically inspired by Karl Popper, by critical rationalism. So this is really something rather traditional, yeah. And for instance, Popper says that whenever a theory appears to you as the only possible theory, take this as a sign that you have neither understood the theory nor the problem which it was intended to solve. Okay, he wants to make 2 points here. The one is technically not so interesting, where he basically says it's very easy to construct a new theory that is equivalent to the empirical, or that performs equivalently to the best theories we already have. So this is philosophical mind game more, but in the background is also this idea of fallibilism, and this is more important for us here. So fallibilism says that all our empirical statements can be wrong because we have no means to assure the truth of an empirical statement with 100% certainty. So this is the idea of fallibilism. And for Popper, this implies that we always have to search for alternatives, for one to be, so to say, self-critical, to avoid sliding into dogmatism. And for another, the other reason, of course, is if all our theories are fallible, are potentially wrong, then there's always, so to say, the theoretical possibility for improvement, for doing it better. And in this critical rationalist philosophy, you would try to find better ways of doing it by searching for alternative theories. So for the sake of both remaining somehow self-critical in your attitude, but also to consistently and permanently search for alternatives, this idea, so to say, of thinking in theoretical alternatives is crucial. And it's also, you can also put it the other way around. This is Hans Albert. It's so to say Karl Popper's most important pupil in the German-speaking area. He has not so many English-speaking publications, and he basically brings the same message, but frames it the other way around when he says a monism of theories can easily have the consequence of using facts only for the illustration or backup of the predominant theory and interpreting them in a compliant way. So here we find that this constant idea of thinking in terms of alternatives is essential for the scientific process as such. It's a core feature that we also need for many technical details. So for example, when we ask what is a true critical test, then one requirement in critical rationalism is simply for a critical test, all alternatives have to be considered, all alternative theories. And this is something we often do not do. So for example, if you think of behavioral economics, for instance, which is quite revolutionary in some instances, most of the work in behavioral economics will, so to say, not try to find alternative theories of behavior like psychologists maybe would do, but they simply would always rationalize the observations with respect to the standard model, and then basically say okay, people are roughly rational, but they have this or that bias, okay? And this is also a way that might be legitimate to sort of say react to empirical evidence, but it's sort of say more on the conservation of existing ideas and not so much directed towards developing theoretical alternatives. So much for the theory of science. This is, in my view, the basic point. So to bring this critical attitude that should coin science really across some pluralism and some sort of say eagerness to think in terms of theoretical alternatives is needed. My second argument is could also be framed more philosophically, but at the end it's practical, and it relates a little bit to what social reality is. And one thing that we can say is that social reality is diverse, it has many facets, and it's constantly changing. And one view could be that to say that our theories will always be able to only cover certain aspects of that complex reality. And this is, so to say, the idea that stands behind quotes like this, where it said that a plurality of paradigms in economics and in social sciences in general is not only an obvious fact, it is there, so to say, but also a necessary and desirable phenomenon in a very complex and continually changing subject. So maybe some diversity of theories is also helpful, not only to improve, to find better alternatives, but to get a fuller picture of the phenomenon we are interested in, okay, and to get a richer theoretical description from a bird's eye view. So I've put one simple example here, namely the increase of economic inequality, okay? And I would say the increase of economic inequality that we witness, let's say, in the last 4 decades in the developed countries is a typical example for that. We have a series of causes of a very different quality that coin this process, that drive this process, and it also has very diverse consequences, okay? And this list here will not be exhaustive. It's just to illustrate that, so to say, potentially some empirical phenomenon like this is shaped in a way and shapes the world in a way that is simply not fully comprehensible, so to say, for one single theoretical perspective. So let's go through them in turn. One reason for the increase in inequality is tax policy. So if you think about the reduction of top marginal tax rates, you know, in the UK, there were once 80 to 90% the top marginal tax rates back then in the 70s or so. This is, of course, a double influence. For one, so to say, the one with greater incomes have to pay less, but on another level, there's also less incentive to dampen, so to say, the primary inequality that arises with respect to the wages paid out. Because if you're a CEO and you want another high raise, then, so to say, this marginal tax rates makes it difficult to convince your colleagues or the owners of the firm. And so this is typically, from a historical view, also considered to affect the primary distribution, not only the distribution after transfers and taxes. Another thing is, of course, globalization. Globalization leads to a shift of power for more mobile factors of production, typically capital, and also, so to say, shifts the balance of power. Another thing that relates to power that's maybe in some way related to other factors, but surely not fully to be explained by them, is the weakening of unions. Another phenomenon we can observe across most of the developed countries. Another argument would be that labor markets change, so technology plays a greater and a greater role, and an argument that is found in this context says basically that with increasing technological requirements, education tends to pay off more, and this, so to say, makes educational differences an amplifier for existing inequality. And legal scholars would maybe emphasize that there's also an increasing legal hierarchy in labor markets. So on the one hand, we have CEOs that typically today become also owners because they get stock options. So they are more entrenched into the firm, whereas at the bottom of the wage distributions, we have phenomena like the leasing of labor, so which also signals some kind of increasing legal fragmentation, which in turn, so to say, deepens wage differential. As I said, this list is probably not exhaustive, and we could do the same thing on the side of the consequences. Macroeconomists would emphasize the decrease in aggregate demand. People concerned with health would emphasize that economic inequality interacts with your health scores. Political scientists would maybe emphasize that greater inequality brings more influence for very rich actors and causes, so to say, another power shift, and so on and so forth. So the two further examples I have here are subjective well-being. The increase in inequality might explain why we witness stagnating or decreasing levels of individual satisfaction. Although average incomes are further increasing, and economic inequality would also have an effect on financial markets, leading to more speculation at the top and more problems at the bottom of the distribution, so problems like non-performing loans. And if we look now at economic theories, I would say that what we typically find is that many theories are good with one or two or maybe three of these causal links sketched here, but no theory covers all of them. So when we ask, for example, neoclassical colleagues, what they would say is that they would typically emphasize this notion of skill bias change, because they say basically your human capital is a scarce good and also a factor of production. And with this kind of metaphor, we can rationalize this skill-based technological change very neatly, okay? A Keynesian economists would at first, of course, look at the demand implications of this shift in inequality, and so to say, the first theoretical argument would go in that direction. And evolutionary economists, who are often concerned with the social mediation of consumer preferences, would probably or like to develop models that could explain this kind of stagnation in satisfaction. Okay, maybe this is not so well known. This relates to what is sometimes called the Easterlin paradox. Okay, and the Easterlin paradox is exactly this relationship. It's empirically contested and all like that. All that is typically with this strong hypothesis, but it basically relates to empirical findings where we have temporal brackets in which average income increases but life satisfaction does not. And this has a lot to do potentially with threshold effects, but it's also sometimes related to inequality, where we basically say what maybe the utility function of the people, to frame it in a standard way, would basically so to say be positively influenced by their consumption, but negatively influenced by some reference level out there. And if we have increasing inequality, and this reference level here is influenced by average income or average consumption, which increases because of growth, but this growth is unequally distributed. So for 90% of the individuals, potentially this consumption here would grow slower than the reference level. Okay, and this is how you try to explain this kind of social mediation of preferences in a now presented in a framework that should also be digestible if you simply know how to write down a utility. Okay, this is the idea that due to a the social interaction, our preferences are affected. Okay, so this is the idea here, and to get a grip on a complex subject like that, it might be nice to have more than one perspective, and this is simply the basic pragmatic idea. The guy I quoted before, Rothschild, was an economist, famous economist in Austria, and also Keynes said a similar thing. He said economics is a science of thinking in terms of models, joined to the art of choosing models which are relevant to the contemporary world. So a good economist can draw on a plurality of models and choose a model that really fits the problem at hand, yeah, or the historical period at hand. And we also find, so to say, a similar hint here. He says that the social material is not homogeneous enough through time. So again, this idea, it's changing too quickly, it's not constant. So basically, these are my justifications for pluralism. So for one, the more epistemologically motivated, and for another, this more practical view. And just to add, we also find this more practical view in the philosophy of science, where it's sometimes said that different theories are like different maps. They give us a different but potentially complementary perspective on the subjects, because, so to say, I can use different maps for different purposes jointly. So what we see in this philosophical metaphor, maybe it has already been implied or said implicitly, is that different theories are maybe not always necessarily antagonistic in the sense that they offer competing hypotheses, but they may also be maybe neutral to each other or complement each other when they focus on different facets or aspects of a social phenomenon. Final remark is pluralism also matters for empirics, not only for theory, and this has to do with the pre-conceptualizations we have when we do empirical work. And the short example I will present here is the elephant curve. I don't know how many of you know the elephant curve. Is actually quite famous. It relates to this time frame here. And here we have the poorest guy in 1998, and here we have the richest guy in 1988, both measured relative to income. Okay, and then we ask, how did the wage at this position in the global income distribution develop in this time frame? So, for example, the median wage 1988 increased by 70% in these 21 years, okay? And typically the elephant curve, it's called elephant curve because you cannot draw an elephant into it, okay? Typically the elephant curve is interpreted in a way where we say, look, here is Asia, and indeed we have convergence, the poor catch up, these are the Asians catching up to the Americans and Europeans. And the price we have to pay for this catch-up is that also the global elite, so to say, gains a fair increase in their income, okay? And of course, this way of framing it is interesting because it shows us, depending on where we started in the global income distribution, how big is the increase relative to the income with which we started, okay? So what gets lost, of course, in this picture are absolute differences. If we say the guy here at the top in 1998 earned $10,000 a month, then his increase is plus $6,500, okay? Whereas the guy in the middle here, the median guy, might maybe have earned, say $200 a month. So plus 70%, let's say, is only $340 plus 140. So we see what this image hides. It is informative and it's not manipulative. It does what it says it does. Yeah? But if we take another perspective, we might even get a fuller appreciation of what's going on. And so we say, this is nice, it's a nice elephant. But we would also say that we lose track of these absolute differences because we always measure it relative to its own base. So we should complement the elephant and ask, how was the pie of total growth in the time frame 1988 to 2008? How is it distributed along this scale? Okay. And if we do this, we get a different animal, okay? We get a different animal because if we ask how was the pie of growth in these 20 years distributed across the global income scale, we find that more than half of the growth, so to say, sticks with the top 5% of the global income distribution. And so I would say the picture is only complete if we add the giraffe. Okay, the elephant tells us something, but also the giraffe tells us something. And the pluralist argument, so to say, on this kind of more conceptual question, there's not really strong theory behind this, is also to appreciate a diversity of perspectives, which shows us different aspects in the data. And this, of course, is a reference to Kuhn. Kuhn also used, so to say, the imagery of animals and said basically, he used this picture and said, many people see this and some will see a rabbit and some will see a duck, and it's the same with the paradigms. So my intuition is if we can use more than one paradigm, we can probably see both. And this is also the idea in my giraffe curve. So here is Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution. If you don't know the book, look it up. It's from a British guy, I think, from Thomas S. Kuhn. Okay, I'm already running a little late, so I'll speed up. Analyzing pluralism, what do? We typically ask a little bit around how open is economics, how diverse is it, and we will find two things typically. One, that it is paradigmatically quite closed. So this is a classic finding you find very often. We have here orthodox journals or mainstream economic journals and heterodox journals. And we ask, dear journals, what do you cite? Do you cite mainstream papers in purple, or do you cite heterodox papers in orange? So, and what we see basically is that the heterodox economic contributions are ignored basically in the mainstream discourse, whereas it's not the same vice versa. So Marxists do cite the AAR. The AAR does not cite Marxists. Huh? And for many, this is as it should be, okay? For me, it's simply a descriptive finding, and it also explains a little bit why it's sometimes difficult to get into constructive conversations on the basis of a more critical viewpoint. A more detailed finding that you cannot see in the graph is that there's also no reciprocity. So heterodox journals that cite a lot of mainstream papers will not be considered more or less by mainstream journals. So how much you appreciate the mainstream is not an explanatory factor for how much you will be heard. So this is one finding I wanted to emphasize. We have a very strict paradigmatic division in economics between the mainstream and the rest. And the second thing I wanted to say is that economics, aside from the heterodox orthodox or heterodox mainstream distinctions, is structured rather hierarchically, okay? What you see here are the top 5 journals in economics, the big 5, Econometrica, AR, QGE, GPE, Review of Economic Studies. And we find when we look at their full set of citations that more than every 4th citation in these journals goes to these journals. Okay, it's a very self-contained discourse, if you want. And this is quite exceptional. So we have here similar sets of journals for sociology, political science, and psychology. And there, so to say, the concentration on the top of the discipline is much less. And we find similar results when we look, for example, what are the important departments, what are the important countries, what are how intense is interdisciplinary discourse. Typically, we will find that the economic discipline is more hierarchical, more focused on the top, more self-contained in the top, and less open for example, interdisciplinary influence. So these are standard findings you have in this kind of literature, and I would say the key idea is, in a famous paper, it has been said that economics is insular, so it's a little bit closed off, not only from heterodoxy, but also from other disciplines, and it's very hierarchical compared to other disciplines. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that and focus and so to say try to explain how did it come to this constellation. It was not always that way. And the short story is that before the Great Depression, economics was actually quite pluralist from a global perspective for a variety of reasons. Also in the US, there were much more economists which had a historical approach to economics. And so I won't go into the details because this would take longer, but in fact, you can assume that before the Great Depression, there's quite a heterogeneity of theories across the globe, at least if you look at it from a perspective that is sensitive also to regional traditions. Then after Second World War, there comes the big division of labor, where we have this reduced form Keynesianism, neo-Keynesianism responsible for the macro side, and neoclassical economics responsible for the micro side. And you know, this was the worldview that is associated with Paul Samuelson's famous economics textbook. No? And then basically after the oil crisis, the stagflation and the Volcker shock, this kind of neo-Keynesianism became discredited, and so to say neoclassical approaches became more important also in the macroeconomic context. Okay, although there are more factors to this change or behind this change than only, so to say, the political developments. Also has to do with internal developments in the discipline. So my characterization of the current state of economics would be this one. We have a mainstream that is dominating the profession, and this mainstream is, so to say, guided by the orthodox neoclassical assumptions that are basically, which is basically what we find in the textbooks. Okay, the textbooks delivers the standard frame of reference within the mainstream. And then we have, of course, dissenters. We have dissenters within the mainstream. Dissenters would either say, this core is not so great, or they would maybe say, I like the core, but still there should be greater variety. Okay, Joe Stiglitz often said that. So basically, I like the core. Today he would be more radical, but maybe 20, 30 years ago, he said some stuff like, I like the core, but we should also listen to those guys, okay? Dissenting does not only mean, it does not necessarily mean you disagree with the mainstream. It might only mean that you would say that it should be more open. Okay? And then we have also these centers outside the mainstream, and these are typically those who would say that we want to have another primary frame of reference. We do not want to have what's written in the standard textbook as the primary frame of reference. And basically this conflict, this paradigmatic conflict between the outsiders and the insiders, you see that maybe this list of heterodox schools is also not exhaustive, it's just as an illustration. And this conflict between in and outsiders escalated in the second part of the 20th century, in the sense that at some point in time, simply journals in economics have been blocked for specific economic convictions and traditions. Okay, and we can also see this historically by examining a trend for newly created journals, which has historically been a reaction to the fact that Keynesians, institutionalists, Marxists find that they are no longer in a position to publish in normal economic journals. Okay? And the exodus starts with the institutionalists and the Journal of Economic Issues, and the Marxists and the Review of Radical Political Economics at the end of the 60s. 10 years later, the Keynesians, so to say, joined the exodus, and they found the CGE and the GPKE. And the next, so to say, school that, so to say, made this move was ecological economics shortly before the turn, from the 80s to the 90s. And this lack of openness is also a reason for concern, I would say, for more enlightened thinkers within the mainstream. Here you have a quote from George Akerlof, not too old, where he says that what I'm worried about most of all is what we don't see. So I'm worried about the analysis that is never seen, that never becomes a paper, and it doesn't become a paper because it can't become a paper. And it can't become a paper because that's not what a paper in economics is all about. And if you submit a heterodox piece to a mainstream journal, this is what you will get. Yeah? So there's some coincidence here. Yeah? And also Akerlof is quite worried about that. And we know that such vacuums exist. So one question that is maybe also of interest would be, is now heterodox economics in any sense better? Is it more pluralist? I would say the answer is yes and no. Okay, within heterodoxy, there are some quite stubborn people who will say that everything is explained by Keynes or some other great hero, okay? You will find that, but in my view, if you look at it from a bird's eye view, again, what we find is that heterodox economics has quite strong ties in a wider net of social sciences, all again measured in terms of citations, okay? And here I compare the citation networks of two economics departments, both in Vienna. And this is the heterodox department, okay? And this is the mainstream department. And this is quite interesting. So this is much more loose, it's broader, it's more enfranched, so to say, and this has many more blue dots. And blue dots in this graph mean non-economic genres, okay? So what we see here, at least in these citation patterns, is that heterodox economics, in a sense, is really more open, as it has, compared to its size, much more intensive ties, for example, to other disciplines, to management studies, political science, sociology, and economic geography also. So having said that, I will stop here. So yeah, this is maybe just saying that some interest in heterodox economics is increasing. This was 2/3 of my talk. And I'm roughly in time. Okay, we have talked about why could it be a good idea to think in a pluralist fashion. We have talked about what is the state of pluralism in economics from this perspective of citation metrics, citation analysis that has its own limitations. And in the final part, I want to speak a little bit about doing pluralism, and I want to present a strain of related research that, so to say, mirrors these pluralist intentions on the practical side. So first thing was that I once wrote a more philosophical paper. It has a nice title. A more philosophical paper on the question why pluralism could be useful, okay? And there we developed a broad strategy of how to think pluralist, and it's a two-step strategy. So the first step is collect and compare with a lot of patience, the different theoretical perspective or statements that are offered by different traditions or schools of thought. So the first step is collect and compare. And the second step would be to decide on a research strategy on this basis, okay? RS research strategy, depending on what the outcome of the comparison was, okay? And we, so to say, have in this more ideal typical paper, we have 6 different relations and 4 different research strategies. And the idea is to basically say the best view on the subject, or the best first take on the subject, how should we approach the existence of different theories, is maybe based on the outcome of this comparison. So if we have statements that are quite close to each other, that are maybe identical, they say the same thing in different words, or they seem to point towards the same direction, would be, so to say, susceptible to integrations. And I would say one candidate for integration, for unification, so to say, of the different languages is the idea of uncertainty, which is sometimes framed as non-ergodicity. Sometimes ecological economists frame it as by emphasizing irreversibility of action. Okay, but in the end, this is all the same basic idea. Because actions are irreversible, the future is uncertain. Because the future is uncertain, because time is non-ergodic, the future is uncertain. So these are quite related arguments that punch towards the same intuition but are framed differently. And this for me is a candidate for theoretical integration. An example for the division of labor, which is in our view most suited for mechanisms that are maybe fit to each other without being necessarily directly convergent, in the sense that they point towards the same conclusion, would be division of labor. Okay, and one example is consumer theory. We can take, for example, an institutionalist, a Veblennian theory of how do consumer preferences emerge, and then use a Keynesian model to ask how do changing preferences impact on the business cycle. And then we would basically combine these two things. Diversification is the idea that maybe some idea that is alien to a certain tradition still may spill over into this tradition. Okay, and an example for me in the history of thought is the spillover of this kind of Lotka-Volterra models, so these more biological models that basically come more from an evolutionary economics perspectives, and they have been taken up in Keynesian circles to model cycles of a Minskyan type, of a more Marxian type, and so. And my final example is monetary theory. This would be the classical case of antagonistic hypothesis, of a test of conflicting hypothesis. And here my example is the conflict whether central banks should target the money supply or the interest rate to steer inflation. Okay, and here this was a conflict, so let's say in the 1970s, 80s maybe, and this is now decided, as you know, maybe from the Taylor rule, it has been now agreed on that, so to say, sorry, this does not work, that we focus on interest rate, okay, and to steer inflation, not on the money supply. So I wrote this a little less than 10 years ago, and then in the following years I tried to put it into practice. And the first thing we did was to do a business cycle model, a model of financial cycles, where we combined the Veblennian idea of conspicuous consumption. Greater inequality leads to rising consumption aspirations, which lead to an increased demand for credit, and a Minskyan banking sector, which has, so to say, its own built-in financial cycle. And we, so to say, combined all that in the Keynesian model framework. And for us, this was an exercise in integration. We brought, so to say, together ideas of a different origin that, in our view, are suitable to tell, in some points, accurate story on the financial crisis. So what we did to combine these three, so to say, origins, Minsky, Keynes, and Veblen, was we had a basic idea on how this works. We thought, so if we really have a debt-fueled expansion, this debt-fueled expansion should at some point come to a halt. And in this halt, so to say, households can no longer expand their expenditures, but they are still managed to pay back their debts, until some point where some household goes bankrupt, and then a panic emerges. And in this panic, both output and debt are reduced. And then there comes a consolidation phase where basically actors in the economy clean up their balance sheets, get rid of the old debts. Okay. And we wanted to check whether this intuition will really the combination of Veblen and Minsky and Keynes, so to say, bring us this cycle. We wanted to check that more rigorously, and we made a stock flow consistent model with two classes, workers and capitalists, and a part of the workers loses income in the model, but still the losers try to keep up with other workers or with their old living standard. In the model it's the same, and this brings us credit demand. Okay, and then we have Minsky and banks, which are basically a model in a way that follow the core intuitions of Minsky. And because we start from a period of economic stability, these banks will provide the credit supply. Okay, and when we let that model run, we indeed found that our simulation results, here shown here below, really conform quite well to the stylized intuition we started with. So what we showed basically was it is possible to combine the ideas of Veblen, Minsky, and Keynes to arrive at such an outcome. Yeah, what we also found that is quite interesting, this is the development of GDP in the model, and this is the development of the components of GDP. And again, you see here the four phases, the expansion, compression, panic, and consolidation phase. And what we found is actually that the length of the cycles can be moderated by a single variable in our model. You see here the cycles becomes longer, here the cycle becomes super short. And the only variable we changed in our simulation runs is how sensitive are individual banks to aggregate debt. Okay. Here they do not look at all at aggregate debt. Here they look a little bit, and here they are very keen about looking at aggregate debt. And this simply makes the difference. So this was a paper, okay? Here we are finished, and then we thought a little bit, maybe, so we had this basic intuition here with the case of the US mainly in mind, okay? But we thought maybe this also applies up to some extent to Europe, and so we explored it a little bit empirically. We have here, again, total debt relative to GDP. This is debt, okay? And here we have another indicator of economic performance. Here it's not output, but it's the NAIRU, okay? It's a measure of unemployment. And what we found that was quite interesting is that for all the European countries, we have data on, so to say, total debt and unemployment, this detrended unemployment data. There are only 3 different constellations, okay? Either we find countries that move in these directions from low debt, low unemployment to higher debt, higher unemployment, and we find, so to say, this trajectory with very different intensities. Austria only goes a very small way, Greece goes a huge way, okay? Second pattern is this one, increasing indebtedness, lower unemployment. This mainly applies to the catch-up countries in Eastern Europe, okay? And the third pattern was all actually quite similar to what we found before. It was this kind of expansion, like here, more debt, more output, more economic performance. And after the financial crisis, it went the other way. It took the shape of this. So we have basically this shape, and a combination of the two. And Germany is the only country that does look different than one of these 3 patterns. Okay, Germany is the exception, but all other countries in Europe from this time frame look like this. And basically we were thinking, actually this is the same, no? This is the expansion phase here, and this is the compression phase here. This is exactly the same. We have the axis differently and the different output indicator, but economically, this would be, if we think about rising output translating in lower employment, this would fit our pattern. And so you might ask, where are the financial calamities in Italy? And we would not argue they are there. They are there. This is the share price of Montepaschi di Siena. You see it's basically worthless. And basically, why is this bank stable? Because the state bought it. So basically what we see is, or what our model would suggest here, would be then that we do not have a financial crisis because the state backs it, the financial system, and if it would not do that, we would have. And then we thought further, and this will be, so to say, my final point in this talk. Then we thought further, okay, this is all nice and a nice heuristic comparison, but can we get a real bird's eye view, a real grip on that? And then we used, so to see, the idea of diversifications. And we said, basically, we do not have a good empirical tool to get a grip on that in our traditional textbooks of econometrics and so. But the guys in physics, they sometimes have these phase charts, okay? And we composed such a phase chart here. What you see here is in the background in gray are all the different single time series for the countries, okay? This is the lines in gray in the background. And then we have cut our chart in these grids. And for every grid, we calculated what is the average movement, direction of movement, and also an intensity of movement, okay? And if you look closely, there is a pattern here, okay? Here we have the highly financialized countries. They have a lot of debt, but very low unemployment. And we have here Luxembourg, we have here Ireland, we have the Netherlands joining soon, okay? So this would be the usual suspect. The second pattern we find is here we have a series of arrows that point to the left or the upper left, which would mean we reduce unemployment with only a little increase in debt, okay? And we call this the path of hope. And the path of hope is driven by data points from Poland, Slovakia, Czechia, Hungary, and Germany. And then in the upper right corner, we have a lot of arrows pointing further to the upper right, and this is what we call the Valley of Despair. Okay, these are the countries that are like Italy, locked into a detrimental situation, and at least, so these are data till 2015 because this is a little older work, but at least in 2015 you could have said nobody has ever returned from the Valley of Despair, okay, in our data. I think Portugal has now made quite a step back, but is still not out. And we see here that we have the usual suspects again: Spain, Greece, Portugal, Italy, but also France is already entering this Valley of Despair in our description. So what we did is our integrationalist or our model that was focused on integration inspired us to think a little bit about the empirical properties of economic polarization in Europe. And then we had some, so to say, first hints on how to do this as shown here, but to get at a more convincing and also inclusive, concise visualization, we simply tried to import the technique from quite another realm of research. So this would be my last example. In a final application, we added concerns on technology, but my time has run out. So what I wanted to show is that a pluralist approach leads to new contribution and perspectives and new impressions if done right. I also hope to have indicated a little bit that pluralism for me does not mean anything goes. Okay, this is sometimes a pejorative interpretation. I think pluralism has there are valid reasons why we should advocate for pluralism, or at least for more pluralism as we have. And what I tried to show in my practical example was this combination of post-Keynesianism and old institutionalism that leads us to the Minsky-Veblen cycles. And then we, so to say, added complexity economics to arrive at the story of polarization in Europe. Complexity economics is a label for researchers that take up insights from the natural sciences and try to apply it to economics for the better and the worse. Yeah? And my last application would have added another dimension, namely a dimension or an argument on path dependency in terms of technological capabilities. Yeah? And so you see how, in my view, the integration of novel paradigmatic perspectives like that of complexity economics and that of evolutionary economics, at least in my personal view, allow me to broaden my understanding, for example, of the macroeconomic developments in Europe as a whole. So this is it now. So thanks for the attention, and I'm happy to receive your questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Kapeller, for this insightful and very comprehensive presentation. So as outlined before, please do ask your questions in the chat if you have any, and I'll read them out. And yeah, just to kick it off while we wait for questions to come in, I'll start with one myself. So over the last, I want to say 2 decades, there's been something often termed the empirical revolution in mainstream economics, with an increasing focus on identification strategies, randomized control trials, and sort of a move away from the more theoretical literature in a bit. And playing devil's advocate for a second here, do you think that that sort of obviates the need for pluralism in economics because it does away with these theoretical debates? Can we now just all go home and run our RCTs and not even think about whether we need to do pluralism anymore?
Yeah, I mean, RCTs are a special thing in this discourse. Maybe let's talk about this first, because RCTs argue basically rather theory-free, okay? And I think there are a series of practical problems that would at least endanger the methodological claims or the claims of methodological purity of some RCT guys, like whether randomization is, so to say, always the best idea, how to allocate the stimulus, and whether it's really randomized or whether it's basically dependent on the local informal structures, stuff like that. But also, I would say one has a huge problem with external validity. So can I use the insight I have from, let's say, a village in Togo to some suburban slum in India, okay, all this kind of, and for that you would always need a theoretical consideration. So but on general, I pretty much appreciate the trend towards a strong empirical turn in economics. I also think that, and I mean, again, for me, the literature reads not modest enough. So there's a lot of, I would say, a lot of posting to get published, and sometimes this biases a little bit the perception of these things, and still the kind of research in literature does not resolve us of problems like specification searches or the replication crisis or stuff like that. So it doesn't solve all problems, but in my view, it's surely an improvement. So what I think is dangerous, and I recognize this with a series of mainstream colleagues. So in Linz, I worked on a mainstream department, and they basically always told me, Jakob, all your criticisms on neoclassical theory is totally fine, but you know, nobody believes it anymore. We use it only in teaching, to keep teaching cheap, and then to use the textbook. But personally, we do only empirics, and there we do inductivism, okay? And I'm personally not I think inductivism is okay. Big data stuff is also inductivism. All this is okay. It's not, so to say, forbidden, but I think it cannot replace the need for a theoretical framework, because you will always have a theoretical framework in the background. And saying that we simply only need smart research design obfuscates this fact that we always need theoretical considerations, and when we do not make them explicit, we have them implicit. So I welcome the development, but I think it does not really resolve our problem.
Great, thank you. And so we have a question in the chat that's on a rather practical matter, and let me just read that out. I'm a mainstream PhD student who wants to convert to heterodox. Would you advise me to get tenure in mainstream econ departments before publishing heterodox, like a SPY? Or should I enter a non-econ department? Does this make any difference in terms of research impact?
I would say it depends on how close you are to tenure and how long. I know some people who basically have a heterodox attitude and they focused on econometrics in their education and their PhD. And then they could, so to say, in the spirit of this inductivist thinking, they could very well survive on a mainstream department. And this works. And it's surely good if you can, at the end of the day, if you think you have a realistic prospect to get tenure at the end of the day, I think this is a very nice strategy, and few people are in the position and have the mental strength and also the intellectual capacities to do that, because basically you always study two things. No, you have to be in these specialized mainstream discourses that are of course difficult in their own way, but still always work on broadening your vista. And for many people this is difficult and some lose track, but strategically this is the nicest solution. So I also was, as I said before, researcher for 1.5 years at a mainstream department. There is also a little bit, when you, so there is the danger, to be honest, of mobbing when you have your coming out, so to say.
Great, thank you. And I actually do have one more question. So you had it on one of your slides, but you also talked about behavioral economics, and I think it was sort of a bit to the left of the orthodoxy. So maybe can you elaborate a bit more on, what's your view on how, to the extent that behavioral economics has indeed challenged the mainstream or the neoclassical mainstream, and is it enough? Does it go far enough? Or what are your critiques of, say, mainstream behavioral economics?
I mean, that for me, there are three views you can take on the results of behavioral economics. Let's frame it that way. Behavioral economists typically show that the standard textbook assumptions are wrong. Okay, that people do not have transitive choices and they do not have a correct assessment of probabilities. They overweigh small probabilities and stuff like that. So we find these deviations to the textbook norm, and you have basically, in my way, three views of interpreting this deviation. For example, one view would simply basically saying that, hey, we know people have a status quo bias. They value stuff they already have more than they work exactly the same stuff they do not yet possess. And this is obviously somehow irrational, okay? And at least it does not conform to the transitivity requirement. And that is why you can simply sort of say, this would be the first interpretation, simply say, in some way, this is falsified, okay? When I was a student, I did interviews with economics professors, so a little bit of qualitative social research is not poisonous. And what they always said is, no, for example, the results of Kahneman and Tversky, which from a Popperian point of view are falsifications in first instance, and then we can discuss what this implies, they always thought these arguments to be extensions, okay? And of course, this is a key difference. Yeah, if what I interpret as a problem for the theory, they interpret it typically as a further strengthening of the theory, as a further broadening, as indicating and showing its flexibility. Okay, and this is the attitude that's also, so to say, encapsulated by most practicing behavioral economics. Okay. They basically say your status quo bias is exactly that. It's a bias. It's sort of say indicating that you are rational, but a little bit stupid nonetheless. Okay, it's a bias. It's something negative. Okay, and of course, I mean, we can say no, we do not mean the word bias in a normative way. It's only with reference to the standard model, but the standard model has also this kind of double life between a positive description and a normative role model, okay? And so it's not so easy to say that this is totally value-free all the time, but this is not my key point. The key point is the textbook model is still the standard reference frame, okay? And I will judge my empirical results relative to this reference frame, and then we have a, let's say, only slight deviation maybe, and this deviation is then called a bias because it does not fit the reference frame, and then we can discuss whether this can be meant in a way that is totally value-free. And in my view, and this is visible when you look at the controversies between behavioral economists and psychologists, and also in the citation patterns, okay? the psychologists typically cite a much broader set of behavioral economists' results than vice versa. Okay. So again, we have this less openness on the side of the mainstream, and there we have the controversy that the psychologists would say this is not correct. We cannot simply say this is a bias, so to say, because we set the standard reference model in stone. We have to think about alternative theories. Okay. And one alternative theory for the status quo bias would, for instance, be that it might be smart from an evolutionary point of view as a smart heuristic to value the stuff I already have a little more than the stuff I do not yet have, because if I have only the outlook of getting it tomorrow, there's always some uncertainty involved whether this will really be my stuff at the end of the day. And maybe this is hardwired, you know, that the stuff we have for sure is somehow something that we can rely on, and hence we value it a little higher. Or for example, you could say that when we overweigh small probabilities, this is a typical bias found in behavioral economics. Yeah, okay, maybe we calculate wrongly, but maybe also our intuition adds a small error bar. And if the small error bar is an absolute value, 1%, then this makes a difference for the small probability, but not for the big one. And this might also explain, so to say. So maybe it's a smart heuristic we use, that we add additional buffers, so to say, uncertainty estimates intuitively to our given probabilities, and then the overweighing would maybe it would be not to be rational in an expected utility maximization sense, but it would be rational in a sense of humans are somehow smart, you know, and this kind of idea that we use heuristics as, so to say, easy tricks and backdoors for quick thinking. For example, if I want to catch a ball, you typically intuitively try to get the angle constant with which you look at the ball. And this is an intuitive reflex, and it works as good as using Newtonian formulas. So you're quite precise with it. And yeah, this is what I would say.
Great, thank you. So we have two more questions in the chat. We have first, how do you view modern monetary theory and recent popular interest in it? Would you consider it to be heterodox? And then the second question is, how much would you say do different social ontologies hinder pluralism in research? If they do, are there solutions to this? And I'll let you choose what all you want to answer these.
A perfect question. My view on modern monetary theory is that they score the easy goal. So maybe I would not, I mean, I like the approach and I like the authors, and these are also, as far as I know them, really nice persons. I would consider them post-Keynesians in the broad sense, okay? So I would subsume them even under heterodox camp. And in my view, their main claim is that the central banks is more powerful than we admit, and then maybe also more powerful than we understand currently, and that we do not exploit its full capacities. And although I would maybe not agree to any claim, and some of the claims MMT makes are rather specific to the US, I would say that, so with a broad brush, judged with a broad brush, they are correct. So we do surely underestimate the potential of an institution as powerful as the central bank in terms of practical policy. Yeah, this is my view on this, and I also already said I would consider the post-Keynesian approach in the broad sense. Yeah, different social ontologies. I mean, this is quite clear. I would not say that different social ontologies are really a hard barrier for pluralism, but they make conversation much more difficult, similar to what Kuhn means with the incommensurability. So if we have different social ontologies or very hard ontological convictions like methodological individualism, this might simply be a strong barrier in practically facilitating some open-minded and pluralist exchange. My solution is something I have maybe in another. My solution to this problem, or the solution I prefer the most, is probably this one. Ha, same graph. So I like this view on ontology. Okay, this is Mario Bunge, and he has developed a concept that is called systemism. And I think the nice thing about this concept is that it basically allows you a little bit better to bridge these hard barriers between we have to think about the whole society, we have to think about the individual. Because in this conception, the system acts as a bridge between, so to say, the aggregate and the individual. And here we would say that we have individual nodes which have relations, okay? And out of these relations can be love or trust or contracts or circular flows. A system is constituted, okay? And this system is again embedded in an environment. And with such an approach, you can have a focus on the individuals, you can have a focus on the meso level, which especially, so to say, relies on these relationships. So it's quite close also to ideas where you basically try to resolve social structures in networks. It's very close to that because it says that basically the systems are constituted out of some form of relationships, okay? And with the system, you always have something that you can also project on a system as big as the nation state, okay? And here you see the definition Bunge gives. He says everything in the world, every entity is either a system or a part of one, where a system is a complex object, every part or component of which is connected with other parts of the same objects in such a manner that the whole possesses some features that its components lack. So because these things are related, because these individual nodes form a system, something, so to say, in the aggregate might arise. And this is basically then called an ontological novelty. I don't know how well this fares with, so to say, Tony Lawson's approach, as I'm phoning with Cambridge, as it may be commented. But this would be my view, how I try to resolve this very pragmatically. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much again. I think there do not seem to be further questions. Yeah, so on behalf of the Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism, let me all just thank you again for taking the time for this very interesting presentation. Thanks everyone for attending and for the great questions you asked. Final item on my agenda, I just want to notify everyone, next week on December the 2nd, we have another talk. We have Özlem Onaran talk about inequalities, fiscal policy and development, synthesizing post-Keynesian and feminist economics for post-COVID-19 economic policy. It's going to be a great and interesting topic, so I hope I'll see you all there, and we'll send out a link for that later today. Yeah. Thanks again, everyone, for joining, and have a great Monday night.
Yeah, have a great evening. Thanks again. See you.
Thank you. Goodbye.